HP Lion Tamer PT2. Hi. Harry said, sounding far more confident than he felt at the moment. You're a hard person to find. I've been looking in nearly every compartment. Would you mind if we joined you? The girl asked politely. She was much prettier than Harry remembered, not that he'd gotten a very good look at her when she had visited in the hospital wing, as it had been quite dark. Then when she had tried to talk to him on the train, she hadn't stayed long enough to really observe her. But as she stood framed in the door of his compartment, Harry could fully appreciate how attractive this girl was. Harry noticed that she was not alone. A girl around the same height, but with vibrant blonde hair and sea green eyes, stood smiling just behind her. Harry recognized the girl, but couldn't think of her name. Sure, Harry said, motioning for the girls to join them. Daphne Greengrass and her friend came in, and Harry saw Luna slide over to allow the girls to sit. Luna stared at the Slytherins, not with loathing as Harry expected, but with mild curiosity. Neville, on the other hand, was staring at them coldly. Neville couldn't blame him. Most Slytherins targeted Neville for bullying. How was your summer? Harry asked as Daphne settled herself. The girl smiled at him and shrugged. No complaints. I wanted to write to you, but I was already at home before I thought to ask you. That's okay. Harry's mind seemed to grind to a halt. He had no idea what he should say to Daphne, now that she was here in front of him. He knew nothing about her. Harry noticed the girl that had come in with Daphne was nudging her in the side, and giving her pointed looks. So, I think you should know. Daphne began, looking a bit apprehensive. I heard something over the summer, and I really think someone should warn you. Warn me? Harry quirked an eyebrow. He'd been able to garner a bit of information through eavesdropping on the Order meetings, but didn't know much more than the fact that Voldemort was after some kind of weapon. Yes. It seems you've ruffled more than a few feathers. My parents were talking about your trial. Trial? Neville asked sharply. What trial? I had a trial at the Ministry after I used magic this summer. They wanted to expel me from school. You're kidding. No, I'm not. But how did you know about it? Harry turned back to Daphne. My father was talking about it. I'm not sure, but I think he is on the Wisengamot. Daphne said. What do you mean you're not sure? Neville asked, his voice faltering a bit. Father never talks about his work in front of me and my sister. And we've never asked about it? I sometimes get the feeling my father doesn't like his work. Anyway, it seems that the minister is hell-bent on keeping you quiet. He's managed to get someone inside Hogwarts. Really? Who? Harry asked, utterly shocked. I don't know. I didn't hear a name, or anything. I just felt like I should warn you. You might try to keep your head down this year, if you can. Daphne smiled gently, and Harry smiled back. I'll keep it in mind. Harry chuckled. I believe you, the other girl said. About you-know-who returning. If you look at things logically, it all makes sense. I'm so sorry. Daphne looked thoroughly embarrassed. This is Tracy Davis. My best friend. Nice to meet you. Tracy smiled politely, offering her hand. Harry shook it and sat back. I believe you too, Harry. Neville said. My gran says the profits become a bigger rag than the Quibbler. She cancelled our subscription. Excuse me. Luna spoke up a bit harshly. My father is the editor of the Quibbler. Oh, I'm sorry. That's just what my gran says. Neville shrank under Luna's cold stare. I believe you as well. Luna said, surprising everyone on the compartment. She stared right at Harry as she spoke. My father believes in Dumbledore, and he says that if Dumbledore believes you, then we should too. I don't want to be rude, or anything, Neville said, clearing his throat, hoping to change the subject and make Luna stop staring at him. But why are you two here? Don't all Slytherins hate Harry? And Gryffindors in general? Tracy looked at Daphne, who couldn't help but smirk. Do all Gryffindors hate Slytherins? She asked. Yeah, Harry and Neville said together. Luna even nodded, looking at them all in turn. Tracy sighed, while Daphne sat forward in her seat. So you both hate us? Daphne asked, looking as if she might get up. Harry felt a sudden wave of panic that this girl might get up and leave, and he wasn't quite ready for her to go yet. I don't hate you. Harry corrected his prior statement. I don't know anything about you. Either of you. Which I guess is the point you're trying to make. Why do we hate all Slytherins when we don't know any of you? And I thought you might not be that bright. Tracy smiled sweetly. We started figuring this out in our first year. We asked the older students why they hated Gryffindors, and no one gave any specific reasons for it. It's this strange bitter rivalry that's gone on for the longest time, and no one seems to know what it's about. What's worse is that we pass it on to each new group of first years. So they can carry on this empty feud going. Daphne sighed. The older students make us suspicious and wary of Gryffindors, so we don't ever think about trying to make friends with any of you. What about in Quidditch? Do you deny that your team cheats during matches? Neville asked challengingly, which made Harry smirk, as his voice was rather soft, and his face was colored with his embarrassment. Neville never spoke in classes unless he had absolutely no choice. Harry felt a pang of pity for Neville, who seriously lacked any self-confidence. No, I don't deny it, Daphne said. But again, you're basing your judgment based on a few select individuals. Don't you think that's a bit narrow-minded? In Neville's defense, Harry interjected. He might be one of the few who actually has a legitimate reason to not like Slytherins. Draco and his flunkies are rather brutal to you, aren't they? Tracy said. A hint of irritation on her face. Neville didn't say anything, but the look on his face spoke volumes. We're not going to apologize for him, as he's a right git, Daphne said. But try not to lump us all together with Malfoy. In the end, we're all just people. Once we finish school, will the houses we belong to really matter? Neville looked like he was thinking it over. Harry smiled lightly at Daphne's point. So, what did you do that landed you in front of the court? Tracy asked as she crossed her legs. Daphne eased back in her seat, but kept her eyes on Harry. I protected my cousin from Dementors, Harry said, shrugging his shoulders. How? Daphne asked, looking torn between curious and wishing to be respectful of Harry's privacy. Patronus charm, Harry said as if it was obvious. Both girls nearly fell off their seats. You can cast a Patronus? Tracy asked. A real Patronus, and not just vapor? Yeah, Harry said, looking a bit frightened by their reactions. When did you learn that? Daphne asked. That's Newt level. We don't learn it until 7th year, and most people never get a full corporeal Patronus. I learned it in 3rd year, Harry replied. I hated how the Dementors affected me, and after that Quidditch match where I fell off my broom, I asked Professor Lupin if he could help me. It took a while, but I finally managed to do it. Is it true you fought off 100 of them at the end of 3rd year? Tracy asked. Daphne elbowed her friend and gave her a pointed look. Tracy actually looked apologetic. She opened her mouth as if she was going to apologize, but Daphne spoke up. You don't have to answer that, Daphne said to Harry. It made him feel nice that, while he knew they were both very curious about the rumors that circulated about him, they were trying to make an effort to avoid asking about them. I didn't count them, Harry said. But there were a lot. Neville's eyes widened at this admission, but he kept quiet. The girls looked quite impressed, and Harry felt a bit of pride in spite of himself. Still, he didn't want to talk any more about things like that. It was likely to lead to what happened in June, and Harry didn't even like to think about that night. Nor was he ready to burden anyone else with that nightmare. You said you had a sister? Harry asked, changing topics. The conversation flowed fairly easily with only a few awkward moments, most of which were instigated by the strange Ravenclaw girl, who seemed to drift in and out of the conversation. When the lunch trolley came by, Harry sprang for snacks for them all, even Luna, who looked truly surprised. Which was almost unnoticeable given her perpetually astonished demeanor. A little while after the trolley had visited them, the compartment door opened. And Harry and the others saw Cho Chang standing there with a couple of her friends. "Hello, Harry," she said, a soft smile on her very pretty face. Daphne quickly turned to look at Harry, who had a slightly silly look on his face. She knew at once that Harry must like the pretty Asian girl, and she felt her stomach drop a bit. She felt a squeeze on her arm, and turned to S.E. Tracy smiling encouragingly at her. "Well, I just wanted to say hello by then." And with that, the girl was gone. Harry's face scrunched in confusion, wondering why Cho hadn't stayed. She had looked rather uncomfortable standing there in front of him and his friends, and wondered if she had hoped to find him alone. She was very upset when Cedric died, Luna said plainly. Harry's stomach knotted, and he felt like me might be sick. He still felt intense guilt at the mention of Cedric's name. Sirius had worked hard during the summer to help Harry understand who was truly to blame for Cedric's death, and deep down, Harry knew that it wasn't him. But he still felt that if he hadn't suggested that they take the Triwizard Cup together, perhaps Cedric would still be alive. Before anyone could say anything to change the subject or reprimand Luna for her lack of tact, the compartment door opened again and Hermione entered, followed by Ron, both with very puzzled expressions on their face. Hello," Hermione said to the two Slytherins, while Ron just glared malevolently. "Guys, this is Tracy Davis and Daphne Greengrass," Harry said, deciding he should try to keep things calm. Not really knowing how his friends would react to the two Slytherin girls. "Also, Luna Lovegood. It's very nice to meet you all." "Hello, Neville, how are you?" Harry watched with a bit of mild amusement as Neville turned a light pink as he smiled at Hermione. "I'm all right. How was your summer?" "Eventful," Hermione said, taking a seat next to him. "And yours?" Harry took that moment to look at Daphne, who seemed to be studying Neville and Hermione. Tracy on the other hand was looking at Ron, who'd yet to say anything. "You all right, Ron?" Harry asked. He knew immediately it was a bad idea when Ron's ears turned a brilliant shade of red. "Why'd you let them in here?" the redhead snarled, not looking away from the two girls. "Why do you assume he let us in here?" Tracy asked coolly. "Is it not possible that we were here first? If that's the case, why not ask why we would allow Harry and Neville join us?" Ron continued to glare at her, but Harry thought he saw a bit of confusion in his eyes. Harry thought it was interesting that Tracy had not risen to the argument Ron had obviously wanted to start. Ron's hatred of Slytherins was very well known throughout the school. Harry wondered how things would be different if people like Ron and Malfoy were more open-minded. "Ron," Harry said, getting his friend's attention. Ron turned to look at Harry, who tossed him a few chocolate frogs. Harry knew Ron was a bit easier to manage when he was eating. At the very least, most of them wouldn't be able to understand his insults with his mouth full of sticky, gooey sweetness. I asked them to join us, and we've been having a good time, Harry said, hoping that would end the tension. How was the meeting? Who are the other prefects? Daphne asked interestedly. Padma Patil and Anthony Goldstein from Ravenclaw, Hermione said. You took Padma to the Yule Ball, Luna said, looking at Ron. Again, Harry felt a twinge of guilt for his serious misbehavior toward Parvati the year before. He promised himself that he would try to make it up to her somehow. He wondered if Ron felt any regret for his treatment of his Yule Ball date. Yeah, so, Ron said, shrugging. She didn't have a very good time. She thought you should have at least danced with her once. Ron merely looked at Harry and Hermione. Hermione seemed to be biting her tongue, while Harry gave his best friend a sympathetic look. So, who are the other prefects again? Neville asked. Hannah Abbott and Ernie Macmillan from Hufflepuff. And you'll never guess who are the Slytherin prefects. Hermione's smile melting away. Harry sank a bit. Malfoy. Right in one. Ron growled. And Pansy Parkinson, Hermione added. Oh no. Daphne and Tracy all but screamed. We hoped it would be Millicent, Daphne explained. When neither one of us got it, we really wanted it to be Millie. She's at least nice sometimes. Pansy's going to be a nightmare this year. But don't you two hang around with her? Hermione asked, puzzled. It's more like she hangs out with us, Tracy corrected. There's only 4 of us girls in our year, and she's got it in her head that we're all best girlfriends. She tells us things we've never wanted to know. Horrible things. Like what? Harry asked, rather intrigued. I don't want to spoil your dinner. Daphne smiled, and Hermione actually chuckled a bit at the joke, while the 3 boys just looked confused. The point is that now we'll have little choice but to listen to her brag about who she sent to detention or who she found snogging in what broom closet. On top of what she normally subjects us to. Tracy groaned. At that instant, the compartment door slid open again, and Harry knew exactly who it was before he looked up. Draco Malfoy looked as perfectly dressed and groomed as ever. Behind him, the hulking forms of Crabbe and Goyle, who looked like they'd grown a couple of feet and added even more muscle, stood waiting for their leader to entertain them or unleash them of their prey. Ron puffed up his chest as he turned to face Malfoy, like some kind of guardian. Malfoy merely sneered at Ron's bravado. Go away, Malfoy, Harry said quickly. Well, I see your manners haven't improved, Draco Malfoy drawled. You need to watch that this year, Potter. You see, I have been made a prefect. That means I have the power to hand out punishments. But it's nothing compared to that amazing bouncing ferret trick you helped Moody with last year, is it? Harry smiled. Now that was something to brag about. Draco's face burned scarlet as nearly everyone laughed at Harry's comment. Draco narrowed his steely grey eyes. You'd better watch your step, Potter. I'll be dogging you all year. You can bank on it. And why are you two back here? Malfoy had just noticed his 2 housemates sitting in Potter's compartment. The 2 girls simply looked back at him, their expressions blank and stoic. Having a nice conversation with some new friends, Daphne said rather icily. New friends? This trash? You must be joking. Draco, in the past 4 years, have you ever heard me utter a joke? Daphne said, her eyes narrowing. I assure you it is not a joke. I have decided not to limit myself and expand my network of associates. You should think about that, you could find it useful. Harry swore the temperature in the room dropped. Draco simply stared at Daphne and Tracy, who remained unmoved. "I've no time for your stupid games," Draco snapped. He shut the door and he, Crabbe and Goyle left them alone. "This isn't over." Tracy sighed. "What do you mean?" Harry asked. Feeling concerned. "He's going to make a big deal out of us sitting with Gryffindors, and how we've betrayed the house or some such rubbish. He'll try to turn the house against us in order for us to realize we have made a mistake. So why don't you go hang out with them and leave us alone?" Ron suggested angrily. "Because we want to be here," Daphne said, trying not to get angry. Her voice was still icy as she stared at the redhead. Harry saw her tense a bit as she spoke. "Why should they only hang out with other Slytherins, Ron?" Hermione asked. "Why do they need to hang around us?" "We don't want them around," Ron asked, his voice rising in volume a bit. "All they ever do is make fun of us, and get us in trouble." "That's only Malfoy," Hermione pointed out. "To be honest, I can't think of a single instance where either of these two have said or done anything to us." "What about last year?" Ron shouted, his anger rising. "What about those stupid badges? We never wore them," Daphne said, her voice rising a bit. Harry knew he had to be the one to end this argument before everything crumbled. The truth was, though he'd only spent a little time with them, he was beginning to like both Tracy and Daphne. He couldn't say why, exactly, but something about them had captivated him, and he wasn't ready to give it up until he explored it further. "I want them around," Harry said calmly. "They've been nothing but nice the whole trip." "Then they must be setting us up for something," Ron suggested. "Maybe some big joke when we get off the train." "Ron," Harry said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer." "I mean it. Think before you speak." "Why do you hate Slytherins?" "Because they're a bunch of slimy gits who are all going to end up serving you-know-who." "Wow, you really thought about that," Tracy said snidely. Both Harry and Daphne shot her exasperated looks, which made her look at the floor. "You didn't think about your answer." "How can you be sure they're all dark wizards in the making?" "What are you talking about?" Ron asked incredulously. "Do you not remember all the things Malfoy's done to us?" "That's exactly what I'm talking about, Ron," Harry said pointedly. "Malfoy's done to us, not Slytherins. I've spent a couple hours with Daphne and Tracy here, and not once have they insulted, or tried to hex me or Neville or Luna. They've been very nice to me," Luna said plainly. "They haven't even called me loony." "Why would we call you that?" Daphne asked. A look of confusion on her face. "Everybody else does." Luna shrugged. "The point is that we're all guilty of judging the Slytherins based on Malfoy's example," Harry said, noticing the look Hermione was giving him. She looked almost proud of him. "You can't assume that every Slytherin is going to follow Voldemort," Harry continued, ignoring the shivers around the compartment at the name of the Dark Lord. "We know firsthand that it doesn't matter what house you belong to for a wizard to be dark. Or have you forgotten what happened third year?" Hermione and Ron gave sharp looks at Harry. He also saw the looks of bewilderment on the Slytherin faces. "Well, I'm not staying in here with Slytherins," Ron said firmly. "I've got patrols to do." "Are you coming, Hermione?" "In a bit. I'd like to ask Tracy and Daphne a few questions first." "Fine." Ron huffed and left his friends and the Slytherins. "I'm very sorry about him," Hermione said sadly. "I think it might be his upbringing. It's not that uncommon." Tracy shrugged. "A lot of the Slytherins from older families aren't that different than him." What was it you wanted to ask us? Daphne asked, still looking upset at Ron's accusations. Well, first off, why Harry? Surely you could have picked other Gryffindors to try to befriend. Interesting question. Daphne smiled. Out of all the Gryffindors, there are precious few who we thought might be receptive to trying to make friends with us. Thomas and Finnegan were out simply because they might get the wrong idea. Hermione smiled and nodded, understanding Daphne's meaning. What do you mean, the wrong idea? Harry asked. Honestly, Harry. I know boys talk. Surely those two have said things about girls they may or may not have spent time with. Hermione said as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Harry saw Neville shrink in his seat a bit. Neville? Harry asked. Seamus told me about what he and Lavender got up to after the ball last year. The round-faced boy blushed furiously. Avoid every set of eyes that belong to a member of the opposite sex. They have reputations, Harry. Hermione smiled gently at her friend, who still looked a bit confused. Reputations not unlike your godfather's. Suddenly it all clicked, and Harry gave a soft, "Oh." Obviously Weasley would be a bad choice, and given his reaction today. We were right. Tracy added. That left the two. Daphne nodded towards Neville and Harry. But why only boys? Hermione asked, puzzled, but before either girl asked. Hermione saw a look pass on Daphne's face, and she recognized it at once. Girls are sometimes harder to get along with than boys. Tracy said wisely. That's true. Hermione nodded. Keeping her eyes on Daphne, who shifted a bit uncomfortably under Hermione's gaze. We must be getting close to Hogsmeade. Daphne said, looking out the window. Indeed. A few moments later the Hogwarts Express came to a halt, and every student began to disembark. Harry gathered Hedwig's cage and followed his friends onto the platform. All around him students were heading in one of two directions. All the first years were following the familiar call of first years, over here please. All first years to me. Except, the voice wasn't Hagrid's. Harry turned to see the prominent chin and severe haircut of the woman who'd substituted for Hagrid last year. Professor Grubbly Plank. Harry was about to ask Hermione about Hagrid's absence when he heard Tracy say something that made him angry. Looks like they got rid of the oaf. Harry spun to face Tracy, and cold look in his eye. Don't ever let me hear you insult Hagrid again. Tracy's eyes widened, and she held up her hands in surrender. I'm sorry. Tracy looked to Daphne, who looked just as surprised as her best friend. It's fine, just don't do it around me. I know he's not everyone's favorite, but he's a really good person, and he gets treated so badly. After everything you said on the train, I'd think you'd be a little less judgmental. You're right, Harry. Tracy nodded. I am really sorry. Come on, let's get a carriage. Hermione suggested. The group made its way up the tiny hill to where the carriages were lined up. Harry spotted Ron waiting for them. He helped Hermione up and Neville climbed in after her. Sorry, there's no more room. Ron said coldly to Daphne and Tracy. Then we'll get the next one. Harry replied, giving Ron a hard look before he led the two girls to the next carriage. He motioned for Luna to follow, as she had not left their side since getting off the train. Harry helped each of the girls into the carriage, and just as he was about to get in, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Tethered to the carriage were two very large skeletal, leathery-skinned, winged horses. Harry felt a shiver run up his spine at the sight of these nightmarish beasts. Slowly, he began approaching the closest one. It lowered its head, peering at him with blood-red eyes, and sniffing at him with its partial nose. Harry. Harry turned to find Daphne had gotten out of the carriage and was looking at him strangely. What is it? Harry asked, turning back to the horse. What? Daphne asked, looking around. This. Harry said, motioning his head to the animal. Harry lifted his hand, allowing the horse to sniff at it. He was surprised when the horse nudged his hand, almost as if it were asking to be patted. Daphne watched Harry's hand stroking the air. What do you see? She asked. That got his attention. You can't see it? Daphne shook her head, and Harry took her hand in his, and placed it upon the beast. Daphne's eyes shone with wonder as she felt the warm soft skin of the animal, though she couldn't see it. Morgana. She whispered. Hey, come on. Tracy called out. And Harry and Daphne got into the carriage. What were you two doing? Tracy asked with a silly grin on her face. Harry could see what was pulling the carriages. I felt it. It was. Daphne looked out of the carriage to where there would have been horses on any other carriage. I thought they pulled themselves. Tracy looked confused. Oh no. They've always been there. Luna said. They're very gentle things. What are they? Harry asked. Thestrals, of course. Luna smiled. What do you think you're playing at? Shouted Draco from across the Slytherin common room. Tracy and Daphne had only just entered their house when Draco had begun his verbal assault. All around them stood every Slytherin from third year up, almost like some sort of tribunal, each of them looking stone-faced. I can't imagine any reason why you would wish to associate yourself with such filth. Draco continued. What are you talking about? Tracy asked. She noticed that every other Slytherin present was staring at her and Daphne with mixed expressions. Loathing, disappointment, and disgust were the most abundant. It became obvious quite quickly that Draco had sown the seeds of discord among their fellow housemates, and was looking for a reckoning. You two have betrayed yourselves and your house by associating with Potter and his Gryffindor filth. You're becoming blood traitors, and there is no higher crime among purebloods. Malfoy snarled, pointing an accusing finger at the two girls, who looked at each other and burst into laughter. Their laughter was infectious, as a few others chuckled softly. Malfoy, you egotistical swine. Daphne said when she finally caught her breath. There is no law that says we can't make friends with Gryffindors or anyone else we choose. I'm not sworn to any oath, nor am I bound to this house by anything other than having been sorted into it. I could have easily been placed in Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, or yes, even Gryffindor. Just like any of you. There were some heated words and downright filthy insults hurled at Daphne, who looked unbothered by it all. She remained unmoved by their jeers and insults, keeping her focus on Draco. The point is that I have only betrayed myself by not trying to get to know other wizards outside of this house. None of you can even tell me why we're supposed to hate Potter or any other Gryffindor. They're a bunch of braggarts. Shouted someone. They cheat at everything. Mudbloods. Potter gets away with everything. That last accusation untied most of the house, and many of the gathered Slytherins shouted in agreement. Can you prove it? Daphne asked, casting cold narrowed eyes on her housemates. Can you prove anything he's done that he's gotten away with without some form of punishment? What about that flying car? Someone shouted. Daphne shook her head. I think it's safe to say he served detentions for that. There's also no rule that says students must ride the train to school. She wasn't sure if Harry had served detentions, but felt it was likely a safe bet. What about the tournament last year? Someone else called out. He tricked the goblet of fire. Did any of you actually witness him put his name in the goblet? Tracy asked. Then explain how his name came out of the goblet. Someone else asked. I can only theorize that someone else put his name in the cup, perhaps the fake Professor Moody. Daphne said, arching her eyebrow, and folding her arms. That bit of news had leaked out just before Dumbledore had announced that he who must not be named had risen from the dead. Did you get a job as Potter's publicist or something? Draco asked, looking as if she were something disgusting. He's Dumbledore's stooge. A puppet for the headmaster. He's nothing special. A freak of circumstance. Exactly. Daphne agreed, pointing a finger at Draco. He is the same as any one of us. No greater or lesser. He's a teenager, just like us, and yet, you all treat him as if he's dangerous, or pathetic. You can't even make up our minds about him. You all jeered him when his name came out of the Goblet of Fire last year, and then when he'd beaten that dragon, some of you began supporting him. I'd never support son of a bitch. Draco said firmly, looking highly affronted at the insinuation. I'd sooner take a blasting hex to my manhood. Is that an offer? Tracy smiled, showing that she had her wand ready. Silence fell around the common room in general anticipation of seeing Draco get hexed in the bits. Daphne turned back to Draco, who looked to be stewing. His face was becoming a violent shade of purple, and his fists were clenched tightly. You've hated him ever since he snubbed you in first year, and ever since then it's been your personal mission to try and humiliate him as much as you can. For what? If you were trying to prove your superiority over lesser wizards, well, you're failing. All you prove to anyone is how small you are. Time and time again, it's been you who's had to run away from Potter with your tail between your legs. You better watch what you say to me, green grass. I won't stand for your insults. I can make things very difficult for you and your family. Oh, yes. Tracy rolled her eyes. Yes, we'd almost forgotten who you are, and who your father is. How long has it been since you reminded all of us of the power of the Malfoy family? You've proven my point for me, Draco. Daphne gave a small grin. Can't even fight your own battles. You have to run to Daddy and get him to throw money and threats around. I can assure you that my father isn't one to cower from your pitiful excuse for a parent. And I, unlike you, can stand on my own, and don't need to run to the protection of my family name. So, unless you can convince me that befriending Harry Potter is wrong, I shall continue to live my life the way I see fit. You're taking your life in your own hands. Draco sneered. He who must not be named. So you believe what Dumbledore and Potter claim then? Tracy pounced on Draco's words like a hungry tiger. You stand by them and their claims. I'd never stand by those idiots. Draco looked stricken. So you don't think you know who is back? Tracy cocked her head and Daphne smiled inwardly, knowing what her friend was doing. Both girls knew there were more than a handful of Death Eater children within Slytherin's hall. They also knew that they would have to hide that fact by following Fudge's decree that nothing was amiss, lest they cast suspicion upon themselves and their families. Worse yet would be admitting that Dumbledore was telling the truth. I never said that. You're twisting my words. Draco looked confused. You weren't going to say that you know who has come back and is going to kill Potter. You weren't going to admit Dumbledore is telling the truth. Tracy pressed. Draco clenched his jaw shut, sending a death stare at Tracy, who stood with her arms folded in defiance. After several moments, Draco stomped off, and the gathering pretty much broke apart as people began heading for bed muttering about what they'd seen and heard that night. Tracy and Daphne made their way to their own dorm and found their dorm mates waiting for them. Is it really true? Millicent Bulstrode asked as they opened the door. She was rather tall for her age, and nearly as broad as Goyle. She had thin lanky black hair, that was not unlike Professor Snape's, which had led to more than a few remarks about her lineage. Both Tracy and Daphne liked Millicent well enough, so long as she was alone. As soon as Pansy was near her, she became hard, and sometimes downright despicable. Daphne wondered why Millicent's personality flipped like that, and had come to the theory that the girl just wanted to be liked. "Were you two really sitting with Potter?" Millie stared at them with something akin to awe. Daphne nodded and Tracy simply smiled as she opened her trunk. "I don't believe you two," Pansy said from her bed, where she was watching them change for bed. "Why would you want to even go anywhere near that kind of scum?" Neither Tracy nor Daphne answered, so Pansy pressed on. "Didn't it stink in there with Granger? And Longbottom, oh gods help me if I had to remain in the same compartment with him. You might want to shower before you go to bed, just to get the residue off of you." "I think we'll be fine," Daphne said simply, shutting her trunk and climbing into bed. "What's he like?" Millicent asked, looking quite curious. "Millie!" Pansy shrieked indignantly. "Don't you even consider following those two? You know what'll happen." "Why's that, Pansy?" Tracy asked, her curiosity piqued. "She could make some real friends, instead of people who use her to protect them from people she bullies." Daphne saw Millicent's expression become pensive as she listened to Tracy. Heaven forbid she might start associating with people who might actually appreciate the person she is, rather than what she can do for them. And what a shame it would be if she actually got some self-respect. You should think about it, as well. A bit of self-respect might do you a world of good. "What are you talking about?" Pansy asked, confusedly. "Do you honestly think Draco's going to marry you because you were his first shag?" Daphne wondered. "Don't you dare talk about things you don't know anything about," Pansy threatened, whipping her wand out from under her pillow. Daphne was faster, and leveled her own wand at Pansy, who looked murderous. "Draco loves me," she whimpered. "No, Draco loves himself," Daphne said coolly. "You're just something to occupy his time. Someone he can flop about on top of hoping to make himself into some sort of Casanova. When you finally figure it out, he's going to already be shagging someone else." Pansy gave a weak snarl, and shut her bed curtains. Daphne sighed and gave a curt nod to Tracy and Millicent, who were climbing into their own beds. Shutting her curtains, Daphne was feeling quite exhausted. It had been a very eventful day. She had managed to establish at least a shaky foundation with Harry. She was very proud of how she had handled herself while they had been on the train. She'd been very afraid of sounding stupid, but had managed to have a pointed discussion, and actually sounded intelligent. Her regret was that she hadn't learned much about Harry. Baby steps, she reminded herself. She had to establish trust with him. Her mother had told her that over the summer. Still, it had taken a great effort not to throw herself in his lap and snog him silly. He had gotten better looking over the summer. She thought about when he'd taken her hand and helped her feel the thestrals. She'd felt so weak in the knees in that moment, and she'd nearly passed out from the inability to breathe. And the animal itself had felt strange, and familiar at the same time. She'd also been quite surprised when he'd abandoned his best friend to ride with her and Tracy and that Luna girl, who'd proven to be quite interesting herself. It was not Daphne's intention to destroy Harry's friendships, and she knew she would have to be careful. She did not want Harry to resent her for wrecking his life. She wanted to be included in his world, not the reason for its destruction. At the same time, she wasn't about to let Ron Weasley, or Draco Malfoy, stop her from trying to get what she wanted. Her mother was right. The only thing that really mattered was what she and Harry felt. With that thought, Daphne closed her eyes, and settled into her warm bed, her imagination slipping back to the train where he shared a cabin alone with Harry. Harry was thinking about what that Umbridge woman had said during the feast. He'd tried hard to listen, and understand, but it's almost like she talked in circles. Thankfully, Hermione had understood it all and had put it in simpler terms. Harry had recognized the woman almost immediately. She had been at his trial. She had tried to suggest that Dumbledore was accusing the Ministry of sending those Dementors to attack Harry over the summer. After Hermione had explained what Professor Umbridge had said in her speech, Harry realized that this was the Ministry spy that Daphne had warned him about. How could it not be? This was the person he needed to watch out for. But Harry didn't think that she was very threatening. And what could she actually do, especially with Dumbledore monitoring her actions? Maybe people were just being paranoid. But, then again, Harry had followed Neville up the staircase as Ron and Hermione were escorting the first years to the dorm, and giving them a brief tour of the school. Harry had noticed how delighted Hermione seemed to be at the task, while Ron was obviously still fuming about what had transpired between them on the journey to school. Harry thought he would talk to Ron later, and try again to make him understand, or at the least ask Ron to trust his judgment on this particular matter. Harry entered the common room behind Neville, who seemed excited about the new password for some reason. Neville was sure he would not forget it, which Harry doubted. Neville always forgot the password, and Harry smiled when he remembered their first year, when they had found Neville sleeping in front of the portrait because the fat lady had refused him entrance. Harry was greeted by a few of his fellow Gryffindors. Colin and Dennis Creevy both came up to him to inquire about his summer. Angelina Johnson gave him a quick hug and told him about her captaincy of the Quidditch team, which excited Harry. Perhaps they could have a game without a long-winded speech like their former captain. Harry spotted Parvati Patil sitting with Lavender Brown near the fire, and took a deep breath. Why wait? He asked himself and went over to sit with the two girls. Sorry to bother you two, Harry said, and was a little surprised to see the two look a bit guilty, but he ignored it and pressed on. Parvati, I just wanted to apologize to you for the Yule Ball. I wasn't a very good date, and I'm truly sorry that I didn't treat you well that night. Parvati stared wide-eyed at Harry and then turned to look at Lavender, who looked equally astonished. Thanks, Harry. Parvati said slowly. That's very nice of you. I know that I can't make it up to you, but at least you know that I feel bad about it. Harry shrugged, standing up. Why can't you make up for it? Lavender asked suddenly, a mischievous smile on her face. Lavender! Parvati shrieked warningly. Why not take her out on a make-up date? You could escort her to Hogsmeade. Lavender smiled, and Parvati looked mortified. Harry on the other hand looked to be thinking it over. Harry, you don't have to do that. Your apology was enough, I assure you. Harry nodded, but then gave a smile. Maybe we could discuss it when we know when the Hogsmeade visit is. Lavender hid her giggles behind her hand, while Parvati, quite embarrassed, simply nodded. Sure. That'd be fine. All right. Well, good night, he said, and headed up to his dormitory. When he opened the door, he heard Dean, Seamus, and Neville having a heated discussion, which halted abruptly when they saw that it was him. Each other them began busying themselves in their trunks, or changing for bed. Harry immediately felt they must have been discussing him. Hey, Dean. Harry said, trying to sound friendlier than he felt at the moment. Good summer. Was all right, better than Seamus's. What happened, Seamus? Harry asked. Seamus looked over at Harry sharply, and took a great breath. Me ma'am didn't want me to come back. Thought I might be in danger or something. Danger from what? Harry asked in disbelief. You, actually. She thinks you've gone barmy, claiming you know who's back and all. Harry dropped his friendly demeanor at once. I see. Harry said glumly. She believed the prophet, and thinks I'm some head case, and Dumbledore's off his rocker. Something like that. Seamus said. Maybe if you told everyone what actually happened that night with Diggory. Why should I? You can just read the prophet like your mother, and you'll know all the gruesome details. Harry was seething as he sat on his bed. He couldn't believe how stubborn the ministry was being about the whole affair, and how easily people were believing the tripe it was printing about him. Don't insult my mother, Seamus said firmly. Look at it from our point of view. Maybe if we knew what happened. No. Harry shouted. He stared right at Seamus, his heart pounding in his temples. Neville, who'd been setting a small cactus-like plant on his bedside table, turned, nearly knocking the plant to the floor. Dean had been setting out his robes for the next day and dropped them suddenly. Look, you've got two choices. You can trust in Dumbledore and by extension me, or you can believe everything the prophet writes and become another mindless sycophant being led to slaughter. Are you calling me ma'am a sick fan? Seamus asked, confused and angry. Sycophant, mate. Dean said helpfully. It means mindless stooge. My mother isn't mindless. Seamus shouted at Harry. She's acting like it? Harry shouted back. Hey! Ron shouted, getting in between the two boys, preventing them from starting to swing their fists. Knock it off. He's making fun of me, ma'am. Seamus shouted. Calm down, Seamus. Dean said, pulling the Irishman away from Ron and Harry. If you're so worried about your mother, perhaps you can ask McGonagall to move you, so you won't be sharing a dorm with a psychotic killer. That'll ease her mind. Harry, that's enough. Ron shouted his friend down. What's wrong with you? I am sick of people accusing me of lying. You're daft, Potter. I can't believe anyone would buy that tripe about you-know-who being back. It's ludicrous. Seamus shouted. I believe him, Neville said in a small voice. The four other boys looked at Neville, who stood holding his small potted cactus. Neville withered a bit under their stares and went back to arranging his plant on his bedside table. You've all gone round the twist. Seamus threw up his hands, climbing onto his bed. I can't believe I'm sharing a room with a bunch o' loons. That's enough, Seamus. Ron said quickly. Harry's just tired. He fought off the imperious curse from those two Slytherin girls all day. What are you talking about? Harry asked incredulously, staring at Ron as if he'd grown a second head. I figured it out during dinner. That's why you defended them. Ron smiled as if it had been obvious. They were using the Imperious on you and you couldn't fight it off. Not from both of them. Are you mental? Harry asked. I told you, they're all right. You allowed a couple of Slytherins to sit with you on the train. Dean asked, curious what Harry and Ron were talking about. Tracy Davis and Daphne Greengrass. Neville said as she slid under his blankets. They were nice. You see what I mean? Ron asked, looking at Dean as if he'd just solved a great mystery. Imperious. Why would Neville say anything nice about a Slytherin? They always pick on him and stuff. I wasn't imperious, Neville said bitterly. Ron, you're being stupid, Harry said, rubbing his temples as if to ease an oncoming headache. Stupid? It's stupid that I'm trying to protect you. No, it's noble that you want to protect me, but it's stupid that you think that just because they belong in Slytherin, they have to be evil hags. With that mindset, you're no better than Malfoy. Harry hadn't seen it coming, nor would he have ever guessed, but that had been the exact wrong thing to say. Harry found himself sprawled out on the floor with Ron standing over him, breathing hard. "You hit me?" Harry asked, holding his jaw where pain was shooting up into his skull. "After all we've been through, how could you compare me to that bastard? After all we've been through, how could you question my feelings?" Ron said nothing but went to his bed, pulling the curtains shut, not even bothering to put on his pajamas. Dean looked to Seamus' bed which had its curtains drawn, and Ron's, before looking back to Harry. "Why do I have the feeling this is going to be a rather long year?" "Ah, Severus, please come in." Dumbledore smiled pleasantly as his potions master entered his office. "I have some news," Snape said without build-up. "In truth, I'm concerned that there could be a divide within my house." Dumbledore looked up from his paperwork, a light twinkle in his light blue eyes. "A divide?" he asked, stroking his silvery beard thoughtfully. "What do you mean?" "It seems that two of my Slytherins had decided to cross house lines, and have reached out to—" Snape's lip curled. "Potter." Dumbledore looked taken aback at this. He stood from his seat and began pacing about his office. "Which two?" he asked of his potions master. "Greengrass and Davis," Snape said quickly. "Interesting. The Greengrass are a formidable family, though they've managed to remain neutral to the troubles of our world. Though, Jonathan Greengrass has supported some of the Muggle-friendly legislation in the past. I cannot recall any Death Eater with the Davis surname." "Nor I," Snape said, standing quite stiffly as he watched the headmaster pace around the room. "Is it possible either family has joined Lord Voldemort's ranks, and you are unaware?" Dumbledore asked, looking at Snape over his half-moon spectacles. "It is possible. The Dark Lord does try to keep all of us somewhat unaware of each other's identities, save for those of us in the inner circle." "I see." Dumbledore nodded. "Do you believe there could be some kind of plot to lure Harry out of the school?" "I do not pretend to be aware of all of his plans, but I think he might have mentioned something, especially if it involved the boy. I think our assumptions about him being too afraid to face the boy until he has heard the prophecy in its entirety remain solid, for now. To be honest, I do not believe the Dark Lord would employ teenagers to entrap Potter." Dumbledore nodded his agreement. "What exactly happened tonight?" Snape proceeded to inform the headmaster of all he'd learned of the events that had taken place in the Slytherin common room after the feast. Dumbledore listened carefully, and when Snape finished, Dumbledore seemed to brighten. "I do not claim to be omniscient, but I think we are looking for trouble where none exists. At least not to Harry. After what you have told me, I think all we have is several young people who no longer wish to be constrained by their house. Perhaps they are disenchanted by these petty rivalries, and are simply seeking to broaden the horizons. Perhaps, but they will be facing resistance from other Slytherins." Malfoy in particular was quite distraught. No doubt his long feud with young Harry played a part in that. "For now, we shall monitor the situation. I do not wish for a war to break out in this school, when a greater war looms over us like a shadow." Snape bowed and left the office, leaving Dumbledore to ponder all that he'd heard. A Slytherin had reached out to a Gryffindor, after centuries of rivalry. Was it possible that others in those two houses could follow this example, and at last the school could be united? Still, the timing bothered Dumbledore a bit. He would need to do some checking, but there was no reason to suspect anything more than young people growing up. Harry was quite popular among the young females, Dumbledore knew, and it was possible that a couple of the Slytherin girls wished to get to know Harry better. And that could be useful if things progressed. After all, Harry needed to realize how powerful a magic love truly could be. Everything depended on that. Please like and subscribe.